His connection with the Goodwin case began late. He was the last minister invited to attend. He had nothing to do with the accusation or the persecution of the poor laundress, but after her death sentence, he visited her twice in prison to pray for her. She confessed to him that she had made a covenant with Satan and was in the habit of going to meetings at which that personage was present. She was utterly impenitent and wanted none of his prayers. However, as he says so sweetly in his account of the matter, against her will, I prayed with her, which, if it were a fault, it was in excess of pity. In her confession, she implicated several other persons by name, but Mather never divulged any of these names, for, as he said, we should be very tender in such relation, lest we wrong the reputation of the innocent by stories not enough inquired into. About the time of this woman's execution, Mather took the little accuser, Martha Goodwin, into his own home and kept her there for several months, partly as a subject for investigation, partly as a patient to be cured by prayer and judicious treatment. For this brilliant young clergyman was also a doctor in medicine of no mean attainments. Besides knowing more law and knowing it to better purpose than half the jurists of his time, the girl showed herself an actress of elf-like precocity and shrewdness. She wished to prove that she was bewitched, and she seems to have known Mather's prejudices against Quakers, Papists, and the Church of England, for she could read Quaker books and Catholic books fluently, and seemed quite in love with the Book of Common Prayer, but she could not read a word in the Bible or any book of Puritan theology, and even in her favorite prayer book. Whenever she came to the Lord's Prayer, she faltered and failed. Gradually, the young minister's firm good sense and kindness prevailed in calming her and making her discard such nonsense. But during the cure, her symptoms showed the actress. She would refuse to go into the study, lined with its goodly tombs of Greek and Hebrew, because her devils forbade it. Then she would go into hysterics of 6 young lady power, until it occurred to someone of the family to drag her all screams and kicks into the sacred room. Then she would instantly grow quiet and say that the accursed thing had just gone from her in the form of a mouse, which is, of course, a bit of ancient Teutonic folklore, a remnant of the doctrine of changelings, implicitly believed by our ancestors when they lived in what Freeman used to call oldest England, before ever Hengist and Horsa sailed for Kent. After a while, the little minx was cured. Her distemper gave way to kind patience and common sense, and the affair went no further. Cotton Mather was a firm believer in the reality of witchcraft. He published an account of this case and its cure. His object in the publication was twofold. First, to prove the reality of witchcraft against a few bold skeptics who were lately beginning to doubt it, in spite of the teachings of the Holy Writ. Secondly, to show the best method of effecting a cure. In this second point, he was in advance of his age, and had others been as discreet and self-contained as he, there need have been no such tragedy as was soon to be enacted in Salem. All personal and local references, whatever could give the mania a concrete hold and a chance to work bodily mischief, he had kept, and ever after kept locked up within his own breast. He had evidence enough, perhaps, to have hung half the old women in Boston, but his strong common sense taught him that the devil is too tricksome a rascal to be worthy of much credit as an accuser. His rules of evidence were far in advance of those upon which the great lawyer, Sir Matthew Hale, had condemned people to death only 24 years before. Mather's rules would not have allowed a verdict of guilty simply upon the driveling testimony of the afflicted persons, and if this wholesome caution had been observed, not a witch would ever have been hung at Salem. Some writers have thought that the mere publication of Mather's book must have led to the outbreak of the delusion in Salem, since it must have helped put such ideas into the heads of Salem people. But this is forgetting that the superstitious ideas were in everybody's head already. Not a man, woman, or child in Massachusetts or elsewhere in the civilized world but knew exactly how a witch should behave. Tracts and chapbooks on the wretched subject abounded, and poisoned young minds as dime novels do in our time. Even if Mather had written nothing, the execution of the Irish laundress and the pranks of her little accusers were familiar topics at every fireside in New England. But in 1692, quite apart from any personal influence, there were circumstances which favored the outbreak of an epidemic of witchcraft. In this ancient domain of Satan, there were indications that Satan was beginning again to claim his own. War had broken out with that papist champion, Louis XIV, and it had so far been going badly with God's people in America. The shrieks of the victims at Schenectady and Salmon Falls and Fort Loyal still made men's blood run cold in their veins, and the great expedition against Quebec had come home crestfallen with defeat. Evidently the devil was bestirring himself, and it was witching time. The fuel for an explosion was laid, and it needed but a spark to fire it. That spark was provided by servants and children in the household of Samuel Parris, a minister of the church at Salem Village, a group of outlying farms from 3 to 5 miles out from the town of Salem. The place was sometimes called Salem Farms, and in later times was set off as a separate township under the name of Danvers. Anyone who has ever visited a small New England village can form some idea of the looks of the place, for the type is strongly characteristic, and from the days of Cotton Mather to the introduction of railroads, the changes were not great. On almost any country roadside in Massachusetts, you may see today just such wooden houses as that in which Samuel Parris dwelt. This clergyman seems to have lived for some years in the West Indies, engaged in commercial pursuits, before he turned his attention to theology. Some special mercantile connection between Salem and Barbados seems to have brought him to Salem Village, where he was installed as pastor in 1689. An entry in the church records, dated June 18 of that year, informs us that it was agreed and voted by general concurrence that for Mr. Parris, his encouragement and settlement in the work of the ministry among us, we will give him £66 for his yearly salary, 1/3 paid in money, the other 2/3 parts for provisions, etc., and Mr. Parris to find himself firewood, and Mr. Parris to keep the ministry house in good repair, and that Mr. Parris shall also have the use of the ministry pasture, and the inhabitants to keep the fence in repair, and that we will keep up our contributions, so long as Mr. Parris continues in the work of the ministry amongst us, and all productions to be good and merchantable. And if it please God to bless the inhabitants, we shall be willing to give more. And to expect that, if God shall diminish the estates of the people, that then Mr. Parris do abate of his salary according to proportion. This arrangement was far from satisfying the new minister, for it only gave him the use of the parsonage and its pasture lands, whereas he was determined to get a fee simple of both. Another entry in the parish book says that it was voted to make over to him that real estate, but this entry is not duly signed by the clerk, and at the time there were parishioners who declared that it must have been put into the book by fraudulent means. Out of these circumstances there grew a quarrel, which for utterly ruthless and truculent bitterness had scarcely been equaled, even in the envenomed annals of New England parishes. Many people refused to pay their church rates till the meeting house began to suffer for want of repairs, and complaints were made to the county court. Matters were made worse by Parris's coarse and arrogant manners, and his excessive severity in inflicting church discipline for trivial offenses. By 1691, the factions into which the village was divided were ready to fly at each other's throats. Christian charity and loving kindness were well nigh forgotten. It was a spectacle such as Old Nick must have contemplated with grim satisfaction. In the household at the parsonage were 2 colored servants, whom Parris had brought with him from the West Indies. The man was known as John Indian, the hag Tituba, who passed for his wife, was half Indian and half Negro. Their intelligence was of a low grade, but it sufficed to make them experts in palmistry, fortune-telling, magic, second sight, and incantations. Such lore is always attractive to children, and in the winter of 1691 and 1692, quite a little circle of young girls got into the habit of meeting at the parsonage to try their hands at the black art. Under the tuition of the Indian servants, they soon learned how to go into trances, talk gibberish, and behave like pythonesses of the most approved sort. These girls were Parris's daughter, Elizabeth, age 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, age 11. Mary Walcott and Elizabeth Hubbard, each age 17, Elizabeth Booth and Susanna Sheldon, each 18. Mary Warren and Sarah Churchill, each aged 20. Conspicuous above all in the mischief that followed were 2 girls of wonderful adroitness and hardihood, Anne Putnam, age 12, daughter of Sergeant Thomas Putnam, and Mercy Lewis, age 17, a servant in his family. This Thomas Putnam, who had taken part in the great Narragansett fight, was parish clerk and belonged to an aristocratic family. One of his nephews was Israel Putnam, of Revolutionary fame. Mistress Anne Putnam, the sergeant's wife, was a beautiful and well-educated woman of 30, but so passionate and high-strung that in her best moments she was scarcely quite sane. She was deeply engaged in the village quarrels. She also played an important part in supporting her daughter, Anne, and her servant, Mercy Lewis, in some of the most shocking work of that year. Beside Mrs. Putnam, 2 other grown women, one Sarah Vibber and a certain Goody Pope, appeared among the sufferers, but were of no great account. The minister withdrew his own daughter early in the proceedings and sent her to stay with some friends in Salem town. The chief managers of the witchcraft business, then, were 2 barbarous Indians steeped to the marrow in demonolatry, the half-crazed and vindictive Mrs. Putnam, and 9 girls between the ages of 11 and 20.